The NFL playoffs taught us many different things, and with, of course, Patrick Mahomes winning his third Super Bowl MVP, I think there's a lot of things to talk about from not only the Super Bowl, but of course, the playoffs. So today, let's talk about the 4 biggest things we learned from the 2023-24 playoffs. Now let's go ahead and give a quick little recap of actually what happened in this year's playoffs. We saw guys like Dak Prescott and Jalen Hurts completely fall under the pressure of the playoffs, whereas guys like CJ Stroud, Brock Purdy, Patrick Mahomes, and of course, CJ Stroud perform up to expectations. And I think moving forward, we're going to see a lot more style of football games like we did this current playoff run. There was a lot of ugly games between teams that probably should not have played as ugly as they did. I look at that Ravens-Chiefs game and the Conference Championships game, and all things considered, that was a pretty sloppy game overall. And I think moving forward, the expectation should be that those teams are going to play better. And while I've been very critical of this year's playoffs because I don't think that the best football players played up to expectations, I still do think that the playoffs as a whole were pretty fun, and I think looking back on it, I can enjoy it for what it was. But with that being said, let's begin by talking about the number one biggest thing that we learned from this playoff run, and that is that personnel will never outweigh great coaching staffs. And to me, I think the 2 greatest examples of this are the Dallas Cowboys and the Philadelphia Eagles. The Dallas Cowboys and the Philadelphia Eagles were 2 of the best teams throughout the entire regular season. Yes, I know that Philadelphia struggled late in the season, but regardless, they still won 11 games. Yet when it mattered most, they got beat by the Green Bay Packers and the Tampa Bay Buccaneers in the wild card rounds. And those were both thought to be teams that could potentially make runs to become Super Bowl champions if they make the right plays in the playoffs. And those were both games where the coaching staffs got completely outcoached, despite having way more talent on their rosters. You look at the Dallas Cowboys and you compare them to the Green Bay Packers, and it's really almost unmatchable. The Dallas Cowboys have great players from defense to offense to even special teams, and Green Bay doesn't really have those same guys. Yet the only thing that Green Bay has over the Dallas Cowboys is a great coaching staff. And the same thing applies to the Tampa Bay Buccaneers and the Philadelphia Eagles. I will say that Tampa Bay probably has a better secondary than Philadelphia, but when you compare talent for talent from both offensively and even some positions defensively, the Philadelphia Eagles completely outmatched the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Yet both those teams got outmatched and got blown out in the biggest stage. You can even look at certain teams like the Detroit Lions and the Baltimore Ravens and the San Francisco 49ers and even the Chiefs, who were able to make the runs because of how great their coaching staffs are. In my opinion, it isn't really shocking that the Super Bowl came down to Kyle Shanahan and Andy Reid. Those are probably the 2 best coaches in the NFL, and of course, it ended up being what it was. That was a great Super Bowl, all things considered. And I think we really saw a matchup of 2 teams who knew how to play football at a high level, and it's really no wonder why they went to overtime and why it was such a competitive game. Same thing goes for Detroit and of course Baltimore. Both those teams were in those games in the conference championships because of how great their coaching staffs are. And you would think that NFL teams would learn from their mistakes this year, i.e. the Dallas Cowboys and the Philadelphia Eagles, who kept their head coaches despite being completely outcoached when it mattered most. And I think moving forward, if we don't see progression from those head coaches who got outmatched in this year's playoffs, I wouldn't be too shocked if they got fired pretty early on next year. I think that moving forward, teams are going to prioritize great coaching staffs over great personnel, and I think that should be the way we move forward in this new kind of era of NFL football. The number 2 thing that I think we learned, and I say I think on purpose because I don't really know if this is necessarily true, but I think that there is some proof that may be out there in this year's playoffs, and that is that experience could potentially be a little bit overvalued. Now, when we think about the playoffs, we think of high pressure, and we think about veterans going out there and playing calm, whereas rookies play a little bit rattled, but I don't really know if that played out this year. You look at teams like the Detroit Lions, the Green Bay Packers, the Houston Texans, the San Francisco 49ers in some extent, and yet despite that, despite not really having a whole lot of experience, they still made it pretty damn far in this year's playoffs. Now obviously the team with the most experience in the Kansas City Chiefs did win the Super Bowl, but I think if we're looking at it from a whole grand scheme of things, a team like Houston and Green Bay had no experience on their roster, yet despite that still were able to perform at the highest level when it mattered most. Now, obviously, neither one of those teams made it out of the divisional round, but I think all things considered, that's a pretty successful run given how inexperienced they really are. And I think as a whole, the NFL community has this really big stigmatism about how experience really does matter in the playoffs, and while I think that matters to an extent, I think we might overvalue it a tad bit. Look at Dak Prescott and Jalen Hurts, who are 2 of the more experienced quarterbacks in this year's playoffs, yet despite that, both lost in humiliating fashion in the first round. The same thing applies to teams like the Pittsburgh Steelers, the Buffalo Bills, and even the Baltimore Ravens to an extent. those teams had experience, yet at the end of the day, they didn't really make the runs they wanted to go down. We saw Brock Purdy, who's only in his second year of the NFL, play like arguably the most composed quarterback in this playoffs outside of Patrick Mahomes when it mattered most. I know Purdy didn't play the greatest in the playoffs, and I've been pretty critical of him and his performances, but when it mattered most, he was making the plays. Same thing applies to Patrick Mahomes. So I think in a small little vacuum, I think we might overvalue experience on NFL playoff teams just a tad bit too much. I'm not saying it doesn't matter at all, and I'm sure that people are going to disagree with me on this one, but I think at the end of the day, if your team has a good coaching staff, has good players, I don't think experience matters all that much. The next thing, and I think this is maybe the easiest one to understand, is you never bet against Patrick Mahomes. There's always been this small little joke in the NFL community that you never bet against Patrick Mahomes, but I think this year more than ever proved that you genuinely never bet against Patrick Mahomes, especially in the playoffs. Because Patrick Mahomes was the underdog through a lot of their games in the playoffs. I think a lot of people thought that the Buffalo Bills and the Baltimore Ravens would beat the Kansas City Chiefs, yet despite that, they still found ways to win. And while I feel like most people were betting the fact that the Chiefs would win the Super Bowl, there were still plenty of people who were not going for Patrick Mahomes and thought the 49ers would actually win the Super Bowl. Hell, if you look at my personal channel and you look at my community tabs, I did a poll about who would win the Super Bowl, and most people picked the San Francisco 49ers before the game actually started. And to me, it just proves that Patrick Mahomes is genuinely not just the greatest quarterback of this generation, but arguably one of the greatest quarterbacks of all time. And I think moving forward, it's going to be very hard to see the Kansas City Chiefs get topped over in the AFC, because this is the weakest they're ever going to be, at least for the next couple years. And Buffalo and Baltimore, and hell, even the Cincinnati Bengals, are not going to get better from this point. They're going to continue to get worse. And that's not a knock on those teams because they have great quarterbacks, and I'm sure they'll be able to beat Patrick Mahomes here and there, but I don't think you really have a good chance when Patrick Mahomes is playing at this level. And I think moving forward, we got to realize that some players just know how to win when it matters most, and that is Patrick Mahomes. He knows how to win when it matters most. Now, this might seem like some top-tier glazing, and to an extent, it probably is, but I think we also need to just understand the reality of the situation here that we're living in. Patrick Mahomes is just him, and there's not very many quarterbacks who are ever going to be able to topple him. Let's just think about this. When Tom Brady was in the playoffs, he never really was doubted, right? When Tom Brady was in the Super Bowl, he never really was doubted. The only time we really doubted him was against some LA Rams type teams. Yet despite that, Tom Brady still lost to guys like Eli Manning. Well, this year, Patrick Mahomes is going up against his quote-unquote Eli Manning in Brock Purdy, yet despite that, he still won. Let that sink in a little bit. Patrick Mahomes, on the weakest team he's ever had, was going up against his potentially Eli Manning type of matchup with Brock Purdy and still won when it mattered most. And yes, Mahomes didn't play fantastic this playoff run, but he did the job and he got the job done, and at the end of the day, you never bet against Patrick Mahomes. Let that sink in, get that through your thick skull. Sorry, I got a little aggressive there. And the last thing that I think we learned this playoff run is that playoff games are won with your second half performance. There were plenty of times this playoffs where the team that won the game was actually down at halftime. You look at the conference championship games and you look at that Lions-Niners matchup where the Lions had a huge lead at halftime and then the second half happened and they fell apart and the Niners won. The same thing applies with the Super Bowl where the Niners had the lead and they blew it in the second half. And there's a lot of different examples that you can go down here. You could look at that Rams-Lions game and say that the Lions won that second half and that's why they won. You could look at the Packers-Niners game in the divisional round. There's a lot of different games you can look at this playoff series. And I think that the number one thing we got from those games was that, well, the second half might be a little bit more important than the first half. People say that games are won based off who has the momentum heading into halftime, but to an extent, I feel like because experience is a little bit overvalued, teams go out there in that second half and play their best ball because, well, that's how they're taught to do so. And I think moving forward, when teams have a lead at halftime, there needs to be a little bit more skepticism about whether or not they're going to win the game, especially come playoff time, especially when the team that's down is the better team. Because good teams know how to win when it matters most. It's why the Chiefs were able to do it. It's why the Niners were able to do it. It's why teams like the Buffalo Bills lost, because they're not better than the Kansas City Chiefs. It's just something that we have to understand, that the second half might be a little bit more important than the first half. Now, granted, if your team is like the Green Bay Packers and you go up by almost 50 in the first half, that's a different story. But if you're winning by a 10, maybe 12, 14 point lead at halftime, you gotta feel a little bit scared because second half is when teams like the Niners and the Ravens and the Chiefs turn it on and play a 10 times better game. So I think we need to stop, again, I'm going to use the word overvaluing here, but I think what we need to do is we need to stop overvaluing a first half performance and really look at how teams perform in the second half. And I think if that's the case, we're going to see a lot more, I guess, upsets in the second half of games. And moving forward, those halftime adjustments, in my opinion, become that much more important. But all in all, the playoffs this year were a little bit underwhelming at times, but also at times had some really great moments. There was a lot of lowlights and a lot of highlights, and all in all, I think we all enjoyed at the end of the day.